Hello and welcome to this special edition of Catholic Current. From Washington, D.C., I'm Maura Moser. As our nation marks its 250th year, we are discussing and celebrating the contributions of Catholics during our history. Today we are speaking with Liz Bruenig, who works as an opinion writer for The Atlantic, often focusing on politics, religion, and morality in public life. Welcome, Liz. Thank you for joining us. Early in your career, you were interested in the theology of St. Augustine, and we now have a pope who's been shaped by the thought of Augustine. What does Augustine bring to our understanding of social teaching?
So I think, Augustine was very important to me, continues to be very important to me as a spiritual guidepost. And I think what he really brings is this very nuanced theological realism. So he understands, for instance, and this is one of his kind of key arguments in the Pelagian controversy, that the church doesn't belong to the saints. The vast majority of people who are members of the Catholic Church are what he calls the not very good ones. People who struggle in their lives with sin, maybe even severely, maybe even repeatedly. People who maybe have certain weaknesses of character, bad habits, addictions, that kind of stuff that causes them to run afoul of the teaching of the church. And he understands that while people do have a deep desire for justice and the good naturally inside them, he sees that the will is kind of warped by sin, and that people typically have a hard time achieving the good and right, at least consistency. So the city of man and the saeculum, these things have to deal frankly with human nature, which is imperfect and marked by sin. But Augustine doesn't at all view this as an excuse for ignoring worldly iniquities. He instead thinks Christians are obligated to do what they can, the best that they can, to establish a just order in the world. So there's a balance between high hopes for humankind and also a sort of sober recognition that humankind has a troubled track record here. And that kind of realism seems to provoke a pastoral practice of meeting people where they are in the world, being sensitive to the ways in which people are wounded, the ways people suffer, the ways that the poorest and most vulnerable people are unduly burdened by the sins of the social order. And Pope Leo really strikes me as fitting that description as an Augustinian. He has these decades of pastoral experience working with very poor people at the margins. And I think that is a great testament to Augustine's legacy, and I'm really excited to see how it plays out in his pontificate.
Yeah, me too. I think it's going to highly inform the teaching that we get out of this papacy. Looking forward to the first encyclical coming out. Catholic social doctrine has long been concerned with work. What do you think is unique about the approach that Catholic teaching takes on questions of work and the rights of workers?
Mm-hmm. So right from the beginning, the very earliest Catholics understood that sort of the fortunes of the faith lie not necessarily with aristocrats or leaders, people who don't have to work for their income, but with the sort of multitudes of poor people who work for a living. And at different points in Christian history, this has meant slaves, it's meant peasants, it has meant waged workers. And the church has always held that there is dignity in every station of life, that work can be a means of worship, and that work is something we do not only for ourselves, but for society as a whole. We have these obligations to create a just and flourishing society, and work is a part of that. In modernity, the church has pushed back strongly against the kind of capitalism they describe as unbridled capitalism that exploits workers and robs them of a decent standard of living and rights as laborers. Rerum Novarum by our last Pope Leo is important here, as is Quadragesimo Anno, Centenimos Annus, and more recently, Pope Francis, Fratelli Tutti. These are all about laying out these guidelines for the rights of workers in a modern economy. And I think the upshot is that the church views workers not as resources to be used, but as people engaged in the productive work that makes society go and it contributes to human flourishing. And the church has held that they deserve the proceeds of their work. And in the United States, this is played out in the church's fierce support for like a living wage beginning in the 20th century, and also the right to unionize, which was famously championed by Monsignor John Ryan in his program of social reconstruction. The Catholic worker movement has also really championed the rights of the poorest and most marginalized people, many of themselves being exploited workers. So I think there's always been that strong tradition of support for laborers and support for the masses and masses of people who have to work.
And how has this played out historically, particularly in the United States? In what ways have American Catholics sought to address the labor question in this country? You mentioned Monsignor Ryan, for example.
Yeah, and I think, Monsignor Ryan is such a great example of the 20th century labor priest. This was a real fixture. And another one was Father Peter Dietz, who sort of bridged the gap between the American Federation of Labor and the church. Dietz and priests of his generation saw that there was this enormous overlap between union roles and parish roles, and they started mobilizing to teach workers about their rights under the National Labor Relations Act. They embarked upon these really fierce and fiery campaigns against inhumane working hours and also child labor. These are guys, these labor priests who I just really can't speak highly enough of them. They've been very inspirational to me in my life. But these guys would go join strikers on picket lines, would help teach people how to unionize, would help them organize strikes and other union actions. Then I think they had a great scriptural warrant for doing so. For example, a verse that comes up quite a bit in Christian writing about labor is Ecclesiastes 4:9, which says, "Two are better than one because they have a good return for their labor. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up, but pity anyone who falls and has no one to help them up." So I think by insisting on the dignity and the rights of workers as workers, these Catholics provided moral language for a lot of laborers to think through their options with respect to unionizing, doing social justice advocacy, and I think, played a pretty important role in the labor movement of the 20th century.
Yeah, I also have such great respect for the labor priests, and that work continues today. We still see a lot of priests working in this field. I want to turn now to the question of the death penalty, an issue that you've written on extensively. How has the church served as a moral voice on this issue?
So the church's moral voice on capital punishment, I think, has changed, has developed in recent years under Pope Francis. And, it probably doesn't escape anyone that over time there have been quite a lot of Catholic leaders who waged bloody wars of aggression and also sanctioned and ordered executions. That history is there. But the tradition is more complicated on this front than I think maybe the average proponent of capital punishment might be willing to admit. So if you look at, for instance, the tradition of churches acting as sanctuaries, part of what you find is that at least in medieval Europe, in my understanding, criminals fleeing execution, they found their way into a church and took refuge there. The civil authorities couldn't enter and extract them. They instead had to negotiate with the church. And the church's role was pretty much always to negotiate that the criminal be exiled instead of executed. And so ecclesial courts of the same period did not mete out sentences of death. And over the centuries, right up to this day, officials in the Catholic Church have written to civil leaders, pleading for mercy in certain death penalty cases. Even Augustine has correspondence with Roman officials along these lines. And the church has generated some incredible anti-death penalty thinking. If you think about the seamless garment idea that, was, I think, put forth strongly by Cardinal Bernardin, we're looking at a form of respect for the dignity of human life that is universal, that transcends guilt, innocence, every stage of life, every person. I think that is a powerful and consistent message. And, there have been a lot of very inspirational abolitionist Catholic figures. Sister Helen Prégine comes to mind. She's a superstar. And Pope Francis, of course, lent papal support to this long Catholic tradition of opposition to the death penalty back in 2018, when he changed church teaching on the death penalty to clarify that it's inadmissible in all cases, citing it as an attack on human dignity. There are Catholic organizations out there right now, like the Catholic Mobilizing Network, who are doing great things to unite believers who respect the dignity of life to rally against capital punishment.
Liz, I have a more personal question for you. Thanks for sharing that on the capital punishment issue. But for you personally, who has inspired you? Who are some of the American Catholics that have been especially important in giving voice to the Church's vision of justice and the common good?
Sure. So for me, Dorothy Day is a major North Star. And, I don't know that I'm entirely on board with all of her political stances, everyone has different points of view on that kind of thing. I don't know if I lean in that much of an anarchic direction, but I respect it. But her moral instincts are always exactly right. And she had kind of a one-of-a-kind way of looking at the church and Christian faith that just really hit home with me. Thomas Merton is another one who I just think has this very humane and very nuanced understanding of the Christian faith and Christian spirituality, and a real respect for how radical the gospel is. I think that's something else that really strikes me about Dorothy Day is she was a radical. She could see that Christian spirituality is a radical thing. And Pope Francis, Pope Leo, the USCCB even, recently have been especially good in my mind at maintaining the right moral line on immigration, even as sort of political conditions have promoted extreme anti-immigrant views. Being on the side of the weakest people, of the people most vulnerable, sojourners in unfamiliar lands, that's all non-negotiable from a Catholic point of view, at least in my understanding. And it's inspired me, really, watching officials so high up in the church really take that seriously. And it's been very inspiring to watch Catholic charities on the ground do everything they can for immigrants who are frightened and vulnerable in the state right now.
Yeah, Catholic Charities does incredible works, and we're so glad for their witness as well as those of the bishops. Since Catholic teaching is concerned with the public square, its place in American life is inevitably bound up with the role of religion in public life. What are some of the ways that religion in American life has changed in recent decades?
So over the past several decades, there's been a decline in religiosity in the West, in the United States. And these changes have happened pretty rapidly. There's been a major reduction in religious affiliation, and accordingly, we've seen the rise of the nuns, right? People who don't claim any religious tradition, though they might have some spiritual feelings, some spiritual ideas. They answer none or nothing in particular when asked about affiliation or relationship to organized religion. Religiosity is especially declining among young people. So in a very real sense, the Catholic Church in the US has been facing some really difficult headwinds just in terms of demographic trends over time. And while I don't think the Catholic Church's social teaching at this stage would be sufficient to necessarily convert people, I think it's totally possible for the Church's social teaching and really foregrounding the Church's social teaching to rejuvenate people spiritually, to give people, nourishing spiritual food to connect them to the Church. And they might be used to hearing, social messaging that has to do with sexuality and gender and that sort of thing. But this is a side of the Church that I don't know people are necessarily exposed to that often. And it's a very real aspect of the Catholic Church, and it's a beautiful thing. And so I think it's important, despite the fact that, the landscape of American religion is changing pretty rapidly. I think it's important for the church to hold on to the moral witness it has here, and not to cede the ground of workers' rights and dignity to people who are much more eager to see workers sort of exploited and treated badly. Those people exist in the public square. And so I think the position, the holdout the Catholic Church has here is very important to maintain.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's so important that we keep promoting the traditions, the Catholic social teaching, and it offers so much hope. When Pope Leo chose his name as Leo the 14th, there's just so much hope just in that name alone, because it hints back at Rerum Novarum and the other teachings of Leo the 13th. As you mentioned, Catholic teaching is full of treasures that are sometimes stored away to be retrieved when the moment is right. What are some of those treasures in American Catholic life that perhaps have been stored away and are in need of retrieval today?
Yeah, as you're saying, there are so many beautiful things inside the church and the church tradition. But, when I think of virtues of the church that we could really use right now, those would have to be solidarity, and thinking about the common good. We live in, a hyper atomized, individualistic point in our history where a lot of the ties between people are thin and shallow, where people report a lot of loneliness and depression, where consumptive pleasure is kind of a substitute oftentimes for deep happiness. You think of people who are each sorted off into their own little containers, like a beehive, not ever really connecting with one another one-on-one, just sort of playing games, watching streaming services, ordering food. These are all things that, are good in moderation, but I think can indeed take the place of a lot of community. And so a big part of what contributes to human flourishing is solidarity. It's community. It's this strong sense of really living with your neighbors and your fellow people, your fellow workers. It's about sharing your strength and also sharing your burdens. Solidarity is about sort of fit community. It's about strong relationships between people, empathetic relationships, close relationships. And I think that's incredibly important and an antidote to potentially a lot of things that are going wrong in society at this point. And then we need a version of the common good that recognizes there more that unites us in our shared project of flourishing than divides us. And it kind of serves as a bulwark against versions of the good that are sort of sold cheap, and reflect, sort of individual gain, not common service. So I think those two principles of solidarity and of the common good are a couple of the great treasures of the Catholic Church's social teaching that I think we'd all use a little more of right now.
Yeah, amen to that. Liz, thank you for joining us today. Is there anything you'd like to add before we conclude? Anything that's been on your mind?
I just want to thank you so much for having me on. This is such an interesting subject, and it was great to have an excuse to think about it in some depth. So I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And thank you for joining us for this special edition of Catholic Current. You can find out more about our ongoing celebration of America at 250 by visiting us online at usccb.org or follow us on social media at USCCB. I'm Mara Moser. See you next time.